So thanks for being here. We'll just go in the order in which everyone's listed on the program. And I apologize for not getting in touch and finding out biographical information from everyone. So I don't have that. I will just give your name and the title of the paper as in the program, and then away we go. So George Dunn, Modern Virtue and Evil in Albert Camus' The Fall. And yeah, please set up here.
Okay. So that light is kind of blinding. Okay. So let's see. I spent part of the afternoon editing this paper because I realized it was much, much too long. And so hopefully it still makes sense, because I had to take out a lot.
It's 20 minutes.
Pardon?
Sure.
Sure. Why don't you can do that? Or why don't you let me know? You want to let me know when it's like 15? Yeah, let me know when then I'll have 5 minutes. So anyway, so this paper is a discussion of Albert Camus' novel, The Faun. But a couple parts. First part, I summarize Girard's reading of The Fall. And in the second part, I try to develop that reading a little bit further, showing that Camus actually illuminates the nature of modern virtue and vice in a way that's congruent with some of the more penetrating insights in the nature of modernity found in Girard's later writings. So Girard's model of conversion and deceit, desire in the novel is the rewrite. The greatest works of literature are written twice, says Girard. The initial draft reflects the author's illusion of autonomy, with the hero standing in for the author's pride and vanity. But the masterpiece is a rewrite produced in the aftermath of the author's painful discovery that his autonomy was a sham, since he, like his hero, was enslaved to some model whose being he coveted and whose desire he copied, though pride stood in the way of his acknowledging it. Girard wants to apply this model of novelistic conversion to Camus, but to do so, he must distribute the process of conversion across two novels. First, The Stranger, and then The Fall, which he treats as a rewrite of the earlier work. Deceit, Desire in the novel devotes only 2 short consecutive paragraphs to Camus, one in which he describes the hero of The Stranger as emblematic of the romantic lie in an extreme form, followed by a paragraph that applauds The Fall as a novel that transcends the earlier novel's romanticism. It is the truth about contemporary neo-romanticism which Camus reveals under the veil of a transparent allegory in that admirable and liberating work, The Fall, writes Girard. But that was all he's had to say about The Fall, until 3 years later, when he published a remarkable essay defending that reading of The Stranger in The Fall, titled Camus' Stranger Retried. Girard's reading of The Stranger pivots on what he calls a structural flaw in its execution, one that not only reveals Camus' hidden intentions in writing the novel, but also reveals his late masterpiece, The Fall, as an exercise in self-criticism and a record of his own novelistic conversion. In Camus' 1955 preface to his novel, he bluntly, and perhaps with a bit of sarcasm, stated what he claimed was the concept of his novel. In our society, any man who doesn't cry at his mother's funeral is liable to be condemned to death. In line with this conception, Camus depicts Messal's trial as a circus in which he is condemned not for what he did, his killing of the Arab, but for what he is, for being an outsider who doesn't conform to social expectations. It's almost as if his arrest, trial, and conviction for murder were just a pretext for the judges, or for society at large, which is understood as a vast assembly of judges, to rid themselves of this man whose real crime was his indifference to their judgments. Marceau did indeed commit a homicide, but within the narrative of the stranger, this deed becomes what Girard paradoxically calls an innocent murder. Of course, the fatal gunshot Marceau fired at the Arab was involuntary, even if the 4 subsequent shots were not. But what matters at the trial is less the circumstances of the shooting than the criminal hardness of heart revealed in his distant relationship with his mother. The atmosphere of gathering doom that Camus artfully conveys in the first half of his novel leaves the impression that Marceau is simply a victim of fate in his encounter with the Arab. But at trial, he becomes the victim of society and of the judges who issue verdicts on its behalf. Girard argues that Camus needs Marceau to be innocent in order to throw into relief the guilt of the judges. For showing that the judges are always in the wrong is the real aim of the novel. The structure of the novel is thus the Manichean opposition between self and other. Marceau alone is innocent in a sea of guilt, writes Girard, and he dies the victim of the others. Evil lies entirely outside the self, residing in those who condemn the romantic hero, who wishes only to be left alone. Sympathy for Marceau is inseparable from resentment against the judges, with all of Camus' considerable artistic powers placed in the service of eliciting that resentment and proving that it's justified. In short, the innocent of Marceau declares the guilt of his judges, and that is where Girard finds a crucial link between The Stranger and The Fall. The Fall is Camus' testimony to his discovery that The Stranger was written in bad faith. The truth of The Stranger becomes visible to us as well when we apprehend the structural flaw that enabled him, Camus, to reach his conclusion, the flaw that is the objective correlate of his bad faith, which his own romantic pride hid from him at the time. So what is this structural flaw? Camus' literary artistry obscures the fact that the novel doesn't really entitle him to the conclusion he sets out to demonstrate, namely, his damning judgment that any man who doesn't cry at his mother's funeral is liable to be sentenced to death. According to Girard, Camus set out to prove that the hero, according to his heart, will necessarily be persecuted by society. But rather than providing support for this sweeping indictment, what his narrative actually proves is something much less interesting and damnatory. At most, he has shown that someone who conducts himself like Marceau and who, in addition, commits manslaughter, might find his neck in the guillotine. Apart from his killing of the Arab, there is nothing about Marceau that would, in the normal course of events, cause him to be singled out for persecution. Yet, Camus needs Marceau to be a victim of society. Thus, he is faced with what Girard calls 2 incompatible exigencies. For Marceau to become a martyr, he must commit some reprehensible act, some crime that will bring him before the judges. Yet for him to command our sympathies, he must be innocent. Camus can't bridge these 2 logically. It's precisely his failure to do so that constitutes the logical flaw in the structure of the novel. But he can and does manage to bury that contradiction beneath his skillful narrative technique that guides the reader to the desired conclusion, warming us to his hero and turning us against his judges. The killing of the Arab functions as a kind of deus ex machina, a contrivance that gets Camus to an ending to which Marceau's own manner of living would never lead. Like a photographic negative, this romantic portrait of the world is false, but handled properly, it can be developed into a true image. Girard believes The Fall is Camus' rewrite of The Stranger in light of his own novelistic conversion. The hero of The Stranger is Marceau, the innocent victim of society's judges, while the hero of The Fall is Jean-Baptiste Clément, the generous lawyer who announces that it was enough for me to sniff the slightest scent of a victim on a defendant for me to swing into action. But even though these two characters occupy different stations in the courtroom, Gerard writes, these two heroes may be viewed as a single one whose career describes a single itinerary somewhat analogous to the itinerary of the great Dostoevskian heroes. Gerard's reading strikes me as right. But it is not the whole story. Unlike the heroes of Stendhal or Proust who undergo conversions like their creators, the protagonist of The Fall undergoes what we might call a partial or perhaps an aborted conversion. This aborted conversion is depicted as a fall or descent precipitated by a shattering encounter with the truth of his existence. Clemence finds himself expelled from what had felt to him like an Edenic existence, sitting on top of the world at the height of his profession as a wealthy and well-respected defense attorney in Paris. Now he has been cast into hell, represented by his current city of residence, his humility, a means to conquer, his virtue, a means to oppress. This should have been his moment of conversion. But something else happened instead. In the first place, Clemence concludes that his case is not exceptional, that his career is just one instance among many of the fundamental duplicity of the human being. He has discovered in himself the radical evil that Immanuel Kant described as the foul taint of our race, the fact that human beings invariably subordinate the demands of morality to the imperatives of self-regard, so that we never do good except from self-interested reasons. Another term for this innate disposition is original sin. For Kant, and for the Christian tradition in which he stands, the only solution is grace, which confers a surplus of righteousness over and above our always inadequate store of good works. But that requires a surrender of pride and a repudiation of the desire to dominate, something that Clemence is unwilling to do. His alternative response is to become what he calls a judge penitent.
Yes.
Pardon? Okay, good. I'm right. I should be able to wrap it up in 5, I think. The judge penitent confesses his moral failings, as Clemence has been confessing to you, the reader, over the past 5 days, but always with an angle. His aim, quite simply, is to draw you in mimetically so that you recognize yourself in the portrait of moral hypocrisy he is painting. And once he has persuaded you of your own turpitude, the penitent becomes a judge, issuing a condemnation that you cannot refuse. He's like the modern white liberal who confesses his own inveterate and inextirpable racism only so that he can indict you of the greater sin of being a racist who isn't doing the work. In this way, Clemence can continue to dominate, reigning in hell, since there's no longer a place for him in heaven. The Fall has an obvious literary answer. Both novels are examples of confessional literature that present truth through the mouth of unpleasant characters. But an even more interesting and telling comparison emerges when we set The Fall alongside Dostoevsky's greatest masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov. In the section of that novel titled The Russian Monk, we're introduced to the life and teaching of the elder Zosima, spiritual mentor to Alyosha Karamazov, and the most revered monk at the monastery to which he belongs. Zosima may be most famous for his arresting declaration, "We are all guilty before all the others, and I more than anyone." Superficially, this sounds like the same doctrine of universal guilt espoused by Clemence. But the phrase "more than anyone" establishes an asymmetrical relation in which Zosima takes responsibility not just for his own moral failings, but for those of others who might have perhaps made better choices if only he had set a better example. As interpreted by Emmanuel Levinas, this phrase becomes the formula for each person's infinite responsibility to the other. Clemence's response to universal human guilt is also asymmetrical, but in a very different way. The elder Zalzamo puts himself in a privileged position as the one who bears responsibility for the guilt of others. He renounces judgment. Some, quoting from Zalzamo, "Remember especially that you cannot be the judge of anyone, for there can be no judges of a criminal on earth until the judge knows that he too is a criminal, exactly the same as the one who stands before him, and that he is perhaps most guilty of all for the crime of the one standing before him." Compare his words to those of Clemence. Inasmuch as one couldn't condemn others without immediately judging oneself, one had to overwhelm oneself to have the right to judge others. Inasmuch as every judge someday ends up as a penitent, one had to travel the road in the opposite direction and practice the profession of penitent to be able to end up as a judge. Like the elder Zalzamo, Clemence puts himself in a privileged position, but not as the one who bears the most guilt and the greatest responsibility, but as the one with the greatest right to judge. Clemence strives to dominate others in a futile attempt to escape being judged himself. Zalzamo has a different vocation, to imitate Christ in taking on the burden of others' sins. We are all guilty before everyone else, and me more than anyone else. Zalzamo would surely say that when the concern for victims becomes a hunt for villains, to blame or an attempt to secure our own moral bona fides by parading our superiority to the sinners, the message of the gospel has been perverted. Did I make it under 20, Curtis?
You get.
Oh, good.
Good job.
What a relief.
So we'll take a few minutes for questions now.
Well, what do you think this idea of a generalized guilt amounts to, both in Zosima or wherever it's found? Normally, if I experience a guilt that is non-pathological, that is not based on a psychological hang-up, it's about a concrete event. I feel guilt about doing something and a corresponding sense of remorse. You know, guilt without a sense of remorse is a strange thing, right? I just feel guilt. So but that remorse is always going to be directed about someone. I accidentally wronged someone. I have remorse about that person. I don't know how that connects to I am guilty about everything for all time and me more than everything. That to me sounds like a description of a pathological mental state rather than because guilt seems to be specific. It's about a concrete wrong. And that's maybe totally wrong-headed to put it that way, but I can't make much sense of an idea of feeling a general guilt for everything and me more than everything else. That sounds like self-advertisement, but probably isn't. I'm just wondering what you could say anything about that idea of guilt as a specific thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfectly reasonable concern, but we need to take it in two parts. I mean, first, what does it mean to say that everybody is guilty, right? And then what does it mean to say that I am more responsible than all the others? So is everybody guilty? Well, you know, St. Augustine would say so. Immanuel Kant, right, would say so. So I'll just defer to them for now. But I mean, Kant's argument is that there is this moral demand, which is that, we act from the pure motive of duty, and we don't, ever, right? And so the experience of of the moral law, or the experience of the moral conscience, is always going to be that of a kind of indictment, right? And Kant thinks that that's everybody's experience if they're honest with themselves. I mean, if you really were capable of obeying the moral law at all times, why don't you? Why do you slip up sometimes?
Yeah.
You know, so Kant concludes that there is the term he uses is radical evil. It's often misunderstood, right? It doesn't mean horrendous evil, doing terrible things, pushing old ladies in front of oncoming traffic or something like that. Not that it's ever crossed my mind to do anything like that, but it simply means that we never act from this pure motive of duty, right? And that's our moral failing. So, and that may or may not, sound persuasive to you. I find it persuasive.
Yeah.
But do you want to say something to that?
If I am to wrong someone, if I accidentally, on the way home tonight, knock someone over and they tragically fall in front of a car, I am not, my sense, even if without the guilt, because I didn't mean it, I will have a sense of remorse about that.
Sure.
But what will haunt me, I won't say, oh my God, what have I done? I have not acted from duty. I've not obeyed the categorical imperative. I'll be haunted by a specific person. And that, to me, I think Kant does get close to what we want to do in affirming a kind of universal love for the sanctity of life, however you want to put it. But it's still, to me, an overly abstract way. If I wrong someone, I will be, and it's got nothing to do with duty. It may not even have anything to do with guilt. It's guilt as in culpability, but I will be haunted by a person. When we wrong people, we are haunted by the people. We are not haunted by the breaking of a duty. And I think similar functions will be in bereavement and stuff like that. Anyway, I
think for Kant, of course, I mean, the words, Immanuel Kant and abstract are virtual synonyms, right? But I think for Kant, it's not quite as abstract as it may seem on its face, because this sense of radical evil is something that we become aware of through a kind of introspection. It's simply a matter of being honest with yourself about your own motives, right? And extrapolating from that to as he says, radical evil as the foul taint of the entire human race, right? So in any case, I mean, you can, certainly you can take issue with him on that, but then, the other point, which is probably a little more difficult to swallow, is this idea, well, I am more guilty than anyone else, right? This of course is very much like Levinas's idea of the infinite responsibility that I have for the other, that I'm responsible not only for the other, but I'm also responsible for the other's failure of responsibility, right? And you run into same problems with that. I'm not sure how to give a short answer to this, but let me try this. In a way, what this is simply the reversal of our typical modus operandi, right? So typically, we are quick to blame others and even quicker to excuse ourselves, right? So if somebody does something that I find offensive, right? Well, that's because that person it's just a total asshole, always been an asshole. It reveals, the deep flaws in your character. Whereas if I say something that I regret saying, well, it's because I was very tired. I was having a bad day, or if you had to put up with the people I had to put up with all day, we're so quick to excuse ourselves because we believe deep down that we're really good people, right? So I think what Zazama is proposing and what Levinas is proposing in a way is just turning that upside down, So instead of excusing ourselves, taking responsibility for ourselves, and a responsibility that is even so extreme that when I see the other person's moral failings, I think to myself, well, could I have done something that would have maybe prevented that person from making that very poor choice? So I don't know. I hope that's helpful.
If I just that's a main.
So thank you very much for that. And I have to confess I haven't read The Fall, so I have to go back and look at that. But I did reread and taught The Plague a few years ago when COVID was happening. I thought I would perversely,
good time.
Be cruel to my students and teach them The Plague. And that was before the vaccine. So it was all online, it was very real. But I'm just listening to you. I'm sort of struck by the character, and I feel like I don't remember it exactly, but there's a priest in The Plague who gives 2 speeches. And in the first speech, it's 2 sermons. I believe in the first sermon, he basically blames the people for the plague. It's God's punishment for his for their lack of faith and evil behaviors. And then later in the novel, I believe there's a second sermon where he basically the priest is basically faced with the horror of this plague. It's very Job-like, and there's no explanation for it, and he can't make sense of it. And then I think shortly thereafter, he's in his bed, and there's this very chilling moment where he turns to face the wall, and then he dies. And I think, and then the hero of the novel is this very selfless doctor who is working in the city to help people at his own health risk. And then I believe he too dies at the end. But anyway, I think that in that novel, if I remember it correctly, that this idea that there is no God, right? The priest is wrong; he's a fool for blaming the people, and you're never going to understand it. So all you can do is act selflessly and help others. That seems to be a little bit different than, I don't know, the Dostoevsky analogy or this idea of imitating God. I mean, and I don't know. So do you have any response or make something with that?
Yeah. Well, I've read The Plague, but it was ages ago, and so I don't remember a lot of the details. But
this idea, this sort of classic existentialist idea of what does it mean to live in a world where God is dead and we don't believe in faith or God, or we just have to sort of muddle through and get through and do things that are right just because we know that they're, the categorical imperative.
Because no one's going to rescue us.
Right, yeah.
So there is no God, so therefore love one another, right? So your question is, how does that relate to, I don't know, Zazama or
to what happens in The Fall and that sense of blame? And I'm not sure exactly. It's just
well, I think that's worth thinking about.
It's such a dark conclusion, essentially. One
you're talking in The Plague.
In The Plague, yeah.
Well, of course, Camus was an atheist.
Yeah.
But he was an odd kind of atheist. I mean, he was in many ways kind of a fellow traveler or tent follower of Christianity.
Right.
It's August.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So he was someone who was very drawn to Christian tradition, to Christian ideas, but remained an atheist because he was not persuaded of the existence of God. So since I brought up Kant earlier, one way that I've thought about Camus, and maybe Chris or others who know Camus pretty well can comment on that, tell me whether I'm completely off base. But, I thought, Camus is sort of like Kant without the postulates, right? So if you know Kant, Kant, has this whole moral system, deontological system, but then he says, in order to make it work, you really need these three postulates. And they're postulates because you can't prove them. You just need them for morality, right? And the three postulates are the existence of freedom, right? And the existence of God, and then the existence of the immortality of the soul, so that the happiness that you've earned in this life you'll be able to receive in the next one, right? So Camus, it seems to me, is very Kantian, but without the postulates, right? And so if you're Kantian without the postulates, what are you? You're a fucking absurdist. That's precisely what absurdism is, right? Human beings feel in themselves this kind of moral calling, but there's nothing in the universe that would lend any support to it.
Then we should get. Okay.
Our second speaker is Jonathan Ivry on D.H. Lawrence in Mexico, an Anthropology of Religion.
Okay, well, I am so excited to be here because, well, this is my third COV&R. First one was in Indiana 20 years ago, roughly. Second one was in Iowa 10 years ago, roughly. And so Mexico City's a lot more interesting. No offense to Iowa or Indiana, but I have a handout here. Do you mind passing that around? And but the other reason I'm actually I was so excited this afternoon because I realized that D.H. Lawrence was not only in Mexico, he was in this building. That there are, I don't know if you saw the murals on the second floor over here. He saw those murals and he describes them in The Plumed Serpent, which is the novel I'm talking about. And he must have seen them only a couple of years, 2 years after they were painted. So I thought maybe at the end I could read you what the character in the novel has to say about those murals, because it's pretty striking. Anyway, so the spirit of Lawrence is perhaps here today. So I want to talk about the British novelist D.H. Lawrence's encounter with Mexico, a part of his life and work that's somewhat less well known than his most celebrated novels, Sons and Lovers, Women in Love, and Lady Chatterley's Lover. Between September 1922 and September 1925, minus a 4-month return trip to England, France, and Germany from December 23 to March 24, Lawrence lived mostly in Taos, New Mexico, and he made 2 extended trips into Mexico proper. The first trip between March and July 1923, where he lived mostly in Chapala and spent time in Mexico City. The second trip between October 24 and March 25, first in Oaxaca, and then after he fell ill, back again in Mexico City. And then there was a long, arduous attempt to get back into the US, which was complicated by the fact that he had tuberculosis and he had to hide it from the border. Anyway, he eventually went back to Europe and he died just a few years later after that. The years in the US and in Mexico proved to be a particularly prolific period for Lawrence, during which he completed many essays, short stories, and a novel first called Quetzalcoatl and later revised and published as The Plumed Serpent, because the publisher thought they couldn't, call a novel with the first name. But The Plumed Serpent is of course, the god that is referred to. And he also published a famous book of literary criticism, Studies in Classic American Literature, a book that he had started almost 7 years earlier, but he finished while living in New Mexico. So Lawrence came to New Mexico at the invitation of Mabel Dodge Lewin, an American heiress and founder of an artist colony in Taos. but he had been fascinated by the idea of America long before, as the book on American literature makes clear. The overarching thesis of his book is that American literature is not some minor provincial branch of English literature, but rather represents a struggle against, and sometimes a sharp break with, English and European sensibilities. The American experiment, he claims, is not born out of a desire for liberty, but from the rejection of the oppressive centers of European power, namely the church and the state, but also alongside these, the supposedly enlightened humanism. Quote, somewhere deep in every American heart lies a rebellion against the old parenthood of Europe, he writes in the introduction. Part of Lawrence's magnetism as a writer is that he is a master of scorn. Writing about the mythical Puritan pilgrim, he says, and this is the first quote on your handout, he didn't come in search of freedom of worship. England had more freedom of worship in the year 1700 than America had. Won by Englishmen who wanted freedom and so stopped at home and fought for it and got it. Freedom of worship? Read the history of New England during the first century of its existence. Freedom anyhow, the land of the free? This is the land of the free? Why, if I say anything that displeases them, the free mob will lynch me, and that's my freedom? Free? Why, I've never been in any country where the individual has such an abject fear of his countrymen, because, as I say, they are free to lynch him the moment he shows he is not one of them. So if freedom is not the true guiding principle of America, then what is? Mostly, Lawrence claims, the Europeans who came to America embodied a desire to, quote, get away. But get away from what? Quote, in the long run, away from themselves, away from everything. That's why most people have come to America and still do come, to get away from everything they are and have been. Now, writing during and after World War I, Lawrence was not the only modernist writer to feel that European culture had run its course, but his disdain for European norms and culture runs deeper than a reaction to the devastation of the recent World War. For Lawrence, the authority of, quote, kings and bishops and popes had been in decline since the Renaissance. But the literature of America also expresses a subconscious rejection of the new humanism and Enlightenment thinking that emerged since the Renaissance, a worldview that insists on the primacy of the individual agent grounded in rational thinking and mastery of the natural environment. The attempt to rationally order the natural world is, for Lawrence, a delusional project that serves only to isolate and alienate the subject from the natural world and its supposedly vital energies. And there's a lot in that studies about vitalism and energy and magnetism, kind of influenced by theosophy and other sort of ideas about magnetism at the time. But writing about Edgar Allan Poe in studies, and this is a good example of his attitude toward rational knowledge, Lawrence says, and this is quote number 2, to know a living thing is to kill it. You have to kill a thing to know it satisfactorily. For this reason, the desirous consciousness, the spirit, is a vampire. And later he says, it is the temptation of a vampire fiend is this knowledge. So the European consciousness expresses a vampiric desire to master, exploit, and ultimately kill the desired object. The horror in Poe's stories aligns with the horror Lawrence saw in capitalist exploitation of workers and natural resources, something Lawrence knew firsthand growing up as the son of a coal miner in Nottingham, England. But if Lawrence is disdainful of the knowability of nature that is instrumentalized and monetized through capitalism, he is equally scornful of socialism and communism, which he viewed as bad faith utopian visions, hypocritical in their attempt to enforce equality through other forms of subjugation. In essence, socialism and communism traded one form of human aggression for another. And then there is democracy, which is also rather hopeless in Lawrence's view. The will of the people, he writes, is nothing but a figment. So there's a little fascist tendencies in there, which is part of the reason he's not really read that much anymore. Lots of reasons why he's not read that much anymore. But anyway, what America offers then is the promise of a fresh start, an escape from a European subjectivity imposed by church and state, and imaginary rebirth. The problem, as Lawrence sees it, is that a culture built on rejection relies solely on a negative impulse and lacks a positive one. The desire to, quote, get away does not translate into true freedom because, as he writes, quote, it is never freedom till you find something you really positively want to be. Rejection of European subjectivity, yes, but creation of what in its place? In Studies in Classic American Literature, Lawrence traces this dynamic, the rejection of the European model and the yearning, often either repressed or sublimated, toward those aspects of human existence that are deemed dangerous, impractical, and irrational in the European consciousness. Benjamin Franklin, Lawrence writes, presents himself as a paragon of Enlightenment rationality and practical wisdom. But lurking underneath is a more venal, murderous rage to exploit and dominate the New World. Lawrence quotes from Franklin's autobiography, and this is a quote from Franklin, "And indeed, if it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for the cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means." So, Franklin is part of that European consciousness, but he's also displaying that underbelly, which is the violence and aggression, which he wants to use on the Native Americans, but he's also denying that in himself, in his sort of self-presentation. And later in the chapter on Franklin, Lawrence mocks Franklin's famous list of his practical Enlightenment virtues. This is in Franklin's autobiography. Lawrence gives his own version, his own creed, and this is the third quote on your handout, that I am I, that my soul is a dark forest, that my known self will never be more than a little clearing in the forest, that gods, strange gods, come forth from the forest into the clearing of my known self and then go back, that I must have the courage to let them come and go, that I will never let mankind put anything over me, but that I will try always to recognize and submit to the gods in me and the gods in other men and women. So these principles are themselves a rejection of Western European consciousness and form the basis of much of what Lawrence wrote both before and after his sojourn in America. They might well be read as Lawrence's answer to the problem he posed earlier about America, that, quote, it is never freedom till you find something you really positively want to be. So if European culture and consciousness is at a dead end, then who is it one should want to be? In Taos, Lawrence identified a non-European model in the Native American culture he first encountered in New Mexico and in Arizona. Mabel Dodge Lewin's husband at the time, Tony Lewin, was a Native American and took Lawrence to see several Indian powwows and dance ceremonies, experiences Lawrence recorded in several essays. And Lawrence was quite taken with Indian culture, even as he recognized that as a European, he would be forever an outsider and should be an outsider. And so I have quote number 4. I had no permanent feeling of religion till I came to New Mexico and penetrated into the old human race experience there. It is curious that it should be in America, of all places, that a European should really experience religion after touching the Mediterranean and the East. It is curious that one should get a sense of living religion from the Red Indians, having failed to get it from Hindus or Sicilian Catholics or Sinhalese. And later in the same essay, Lawrence tries to explain the essence of this indigenous religious worldview. Describing one ritual that he witnessed, Lawrence writes that the point of the ritual, and this is quote number 5, the point of the ritual was to get power, to get strength, to come by sheer cumulative hurling effort of the bodies of men into contact with the great cosmic sources of vitality, which give strength, power, energy to the men who can grasp it, energy for the zeal of attainment. It was a vast old religion, greater than anything we know, more starkly and nakedly religious. There is no God, no conception of a God, all is God, but it is not the pantheism we are accustomed to, which expresses itself as God is everywhere, God is in everything. In the oldest religion, everything was alive, not supernaturally, but naturally alive. There were only deeper and deeper streams of life, vibrations of life, more and more vast. So rocks were alive, but a mountain had a deeper, vaster life than a rock, and it was much harder for a man to bring his spirit or his energy into contact with the life of the mountain, and so draw strength from the mountain as from a standing well of life than it was to come into contact with the rock. I'm sort of reminded of the lecture this morning that the Claire gave about cannibalism and taking in the energy of your enemy. And he had to put forth a great religious effort, for the whole life effort of man was to get his life into direct contact with the elemental life of the cosmos, mountain life, cloud life, thunder life, air life, earth life, sun life, to come into immediate felt contact and so derive energy, power, and a dark sort of joy. This effort into sheer, naked contact without an intermediary or mediator is the root meaning of religion. So I want to turn now to two major fiction works of this period, the short story The Woman Who Rode Away and the novel The Plumed Serpent. The Plumed Serpent is a difficult, somewhat haphazard novel that tries to translate into novel form many of Lawrence's impressions of Mexico. It is long-winded and full of racist disdain toward Mexicans, but it's a disdain that's grounded in what Lawrence felt was the corruption of the indigenous ways of life by centuries of Spanish colonialism. In the novel, a 40-year-old Irish widow named Kate Leslie finds herself in Mexico. At first, she is repelled by the Mexican culture. The first chapter describes her experience at a bullfight. And yet she is equally disdainful of her American cousin and the bourgeois expatriates she meets in Mexico. Eventually, she finds herself drawn into the circle of two men, Don Cipriano and Ramon Carrasco, who are working to resuscitate the old Aztec gods of indigenous Mexico and revitalize Mexican culture and society through this new old religion. Christianity is seen as an enervated religion that has been imposed on Mexico by the Spanish colonial powers. It is doomed to failure in Mexico because it is an inauthentic importation that is non-indigenous. And socialism is also presented as essentially foreign and inauthentic to the Mexican spirit, hence his horror at those murals in the hallway out there. Kate is drawn to the new religion, feeling a sense of weariness with her European Christian background. And there are many quotes about this, but I'll just read the one that's number 6. Her Irish spirit was weary to death of definite meanings and a God of one fixed purpose. Gods should be iridescent like the rainbow in the storm. Man creates a God in his own image, and the gods grow old along with the men that made them. But storms sway in heaven, and the God stuff sways high and angry over our heads. Gods die with men who have conceived them, but the God stuff roars eternally like the sea, with too vast a sound to be heard, like the sea in storm that beats against the rock of living, stiffened men slowly to destroy them, or like the sea of the glimmering ethereal plasm of the world that bathes the feet and the knees of men as earth sap bathes the roots of trees. Ye must be born again. Even the gods must be born again. We must be born again. By the end of this strange novel, Kate marries Cipriano and is joined up with him and Carrasco to become a sort of holy trinity of quasi-divine figures. And interestingly, in the original version, she decides to leave Mexico rather than committing herself to these men and their new religion. So that's interesting, this idea that the novels always are revisions. I mean, he literally revised this novel before publishing it. The Woman Who Rode Away is even more shocking, and this is actually one of the stories that kind of cemented the turn against Lawrence in the 1960s, but that's a whole other story. In this story, an unnamed American woman living in rural Mexico decides rather impulsively to leave her absent husband, a somewhat fallen-in-the-world silver mine magnate, and her children to ride off into the remote forest, without quite knowing why or where she is going, only that she must get away, like the original Europeans who came to America that Lawrence had described in his book on American literature. She ends up being captured by a remote native tribe who take her high up to their village in the mountains. There she's held prisoner for several months, but is treated like a demigod. Eventually, she understands that she is to be sacrificed in a ritual on the winter solstice. The story ends just before the moment of the sacrificial killing. So it's a very shocking story, a shocking ending, very Girardian. In fact, there was an essay that was like a Girardian reading of this short story. As in The Plumed Serpent, here a white woman participates in the renewal of an ancient religion, although in a much more brutal fashion as the sacrificial victim. Like Kate in The Plumed Serpent, the unnamed woman in this story starts off repulsed by the native people around her, but she's also drawn to the vitality of their religion, and eventually she seems to submit to her place in this larger ritual, almost grateful to give up the burden of her Western individualism and consciousness and participate instead in a mystical rite for which she serves a crucial function. As a solstice sacrifice, that function is both a renewal of the sun's power and arc over the earth, but also, as the story makes clear, an attempt to rescue the Indian way of life against the encroachment of the white man's economy. The young Indian who serves as the woman's jailer, having spent some time in the U.S., explains to the woman, and that's the last quote, "The Indian got weak and lost his power with the sun. So the white men stole the sun, but they can't keep him. They don't know how. They got him, but they don't know what to do with him. Like a boy who catch a big grizzly bear and can't kill him and can't run away from him. The grizzly bear eats the boy that catch him when he want to run away from him. White men don't know what they are doing with the sun, and white women don't know what they do with the moon. The moon, she got angry with white women like a puma when someone kills her little ones. The moon, she bites white women here inside," and he pressed his side. "The moon, she is angry in a white woman's cave. The Indian can see it, and soon," he added, "the Indian women get the moon back and keep her quiet in their house, and the Indian men get the sun and the power over all the world. White men don't know what the sun is. They never know." The white man's knowledge is intellectual, instrumental, but out of touch with the essential power of the sun. The sacrificial ritual, while brutal and horrific, mystically taps into the primal energies of nature. It represents a different sort of knowledge, one embedded in unconscious, almost instinctual actions that nevertheless connect people more powerfully to their existence than the European model of abstract thinking and exploitation. The first Europeans came to this country searching for that lost power, but like the boy with the grizzly, they do not know what to do with it or how to harness its energy. Did Lawrence really want the return of a largely extinct Mesoamerican religion complete with human sacrifice? Of course, such a return is not possible or desirable in the real world, but fiction is an appropriate space in which to imagine possibilities. The point of Lawrence's Mexican fantasies, I think, is less to valorize so-called primitive practices, but to recognize what is lost in the hegemony of Western culture. It's no accident the woman's husband has made his fortune in the silver mines of rural Mexico. The exploitation of the land represents the Western perspective that supports violence and exploitation against the natural resources, and those natural resources, of course, extend to the people living on that land. The woman's sacrifice can be seen in part as an act of atonement on behalf of her people. Yet, contrary to what her young Indian captor believes, it seems clear that her death will not bring back the power or dominance of these native cultures. But more broadly, we might turn just for a moment to René Girard's theories of sacrifice as a point of contrast. Girard has linked the breaking of the almost trance-like hold that sacrifice and human sacrifice has had on human cultures to the end of a mythic understanding of the world. The Gospels are said to record the moment when the essential innocence of the sacrificial victim, that is, Jesus, is first and finally understood, thereby exposing the lie that the scapegoat victim is deserving of punishment and putting an end to the sacred violence that cultures used unwittingly as a way to forestall greater violence. I'm not sure if Girard ever makes the connection explicitly to rational and abstract thinking, and maybe people in here can enlighten me. But the process of recognition, the exposure of the scandal of sacrifice, that is a thought process in contrast to the ritualistic action of a sacrifice. In determining that the sacrifice is a lie, an action without consequence, or one whose consequence is fundamentally misunderstood by its practitioners, the culture shifts into a worldview based on law and judgment. You have to think about what is going on, and you have to realize that there's something false about that ritual. Now the end to the cycle of mimetic violence is not a scapegoat or sacrifice, but the transfer of punishment and the determination of that punishment, a determination of guilt or innocence, to a disinterested third party, a judicial system, which, is another way of maybe instantiating the desire for sacrifice, but it's not the same, right? One could argue that the shift from the unconscious sacrifice to conscious rational thinking is already set in motion in the Old Testament, insofar as the revelation of God's power at Mount Sinai is the revelation of a legal code, which demands judges or interpreters of that law, such that sacrifice already starts the process of becoming more marginalized in the Old Testament. The development of this rational judging intellect leads eventually, of course, to science, such that a winter solstice no longer signifies a crisis whose solution demands human blood. Indeed, already in Deuteronomy, the Bible warns against reading supernatural meanings in the stars. Quote, "And when you look up to the heavens and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the host of heaven, do not be led astray and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples everywhere under heaven." That's Deuteronomy 4:19. What an amazing and kind of striking verse that is, right? That how did the authors of the Bible come to that determination that the stars were not signs of gods and demanded, sacrifice? So apart from the disruption of the cycle of mimetic violence that sacrifice is said to initiate, the development of rational thinking that disrupts magical thinking is already present to an extent in the Hebrew Bible, not to mention, of course, in Greek philosophy. But to return to Lawrence, as Lawrence points out, this rational mind inevitably seems divorced from the sacred in some way, divorced from the physical body, from the cycles of seasonal time, from families and tribal affiliations, even from the vibrations of the earth. It is this Cartesian divided mind-body where the solipsistic mind exists separate and isolated from everything, and whose knowledge ends up being a kind of blindness. Lawrence was under no illusions that we could turn back historical time to reclaim a point before such a false and misleading awakening. Yet his experiences in Mexico reveal that the Western mind and technological superiority that we take for granted comes at a tremendous cost. And to that effect, a spiritual healing, the rational mind needs to surrender its desire for mastery and power, to participate in the world in a more direct way rather than always determined to know it, which ultimately is the real killing of the innocent. Thank you.
So I thought it was really interesting when you said you're sort of posing the rhetorical question about whether Lawrence really was into the idea of reviving some sort of Mesoamerican tradition. It seemed like a good question, but a strange one, because if the whole European American myth was about exploiting and imposing one's will violently upon another culture, to then say, no, we don't need that, we need this instead, this incredibly violent, sacrificial culture. It's such a strange move for him to go from that to that. And I'm curious about it. I don't know if I have a question.
Well, I would say, okay, so I think he's being provocative in that short story, for sure. In his essays on Native American culture in New Mexico, though, there is this tremendous sense of honoring the spirit of a place and the culture that emerges from like the rocks and the trees. And I mean, it is a kind of quasi-pagan-ish attitude. I mean, he has a great essay called Pan in America, where he talks about the great god Pan dying in Europe and, killed off by Christianity, but Pan is alive in America. So I don't know that he necessarily is saying, let's go back to sacrifice, but let's go back to something where we exist in relation to the world in an elemental way that releases us from the burden of being an individual, a human, and And that's why this woman, both in The Plumed Serpent, but in the story, they're just tired of being, Western women. And they just want to, and this is why he was attacked very famously in this book by Kate Millett called Sexual Politics as a misogynist, right? Because these women are tired of being Western women. But of course, the Western men are tired of being Western men, right? Because they're also alienated and isolated, and everything is about making money and exploiting. And so yeah, I guess that would be my answer. But I would also say that he essentially was not a systematic thinker in a way. I mean, he kind of got on these kicks, and after he left this, he went back to Europe and wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover. So, he just went back to sex as a way to kind of tap into the elemental stuff. It's less political. It's maybe more exciting. Yeah, I think it's interesting to revisit it now, because we hear this discourse now more than we used to in the 60s about Western ways of thinking as destructive and too rational, exploitative, and sort of honoring non-Western ways of thinking. Of course, that can be dangerous too, but so I think it resonates differently today.
Yeah. Good. Thanks. We'll put it to our thing.
Okay.
All right, so our final speaker is Gary Schmidt on animals, deities, and sacrifice in Borges and Cortazar. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, just checking with that.
Can I use this one?
Post that. Thank
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm Gary. In my former career as an academic, I was actually a scholar of British Renaissance literature, so this isn't really my field of inquiry. But I thought when I found out that the conference was here in Mexico City, two particular works came to mind that both had a subtext that I thought was broadly Girardian, but also a kind of like a mythos or a setting, a subtext. I would call it a subtext. You'll see what I mean. In both of these works that I'm about to discuss, the connection to Mexico City is not overt, but it is relevant, I think, to the whole conversation. So anyway, my thought was to put two short stories by two Argentinian writers in conversation, along with some of Girard's theories, and also with some of the Aztec mythology as well, and some of which has been discussed earlier today. So I'm curious, if anything comes to you in this conversation. I'm really sort of just putting all of these things in a kind of fluid conversation, and I'm interested to see what might come out of it. But so the first work is this one, The God Script, La Escritura del Dios by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer, 1949. He wrote this short story. The second writer I'm going to be discussing is Julio Cortazar, who was also Argentinian and a great admirer of Borges. And so in some sense, the second story would be seen maybe as a response to or a revision of the first one. So you can sort of imagine them through that lens. So I'll treat these stories. Both of the plots of both of these stories are relatively simple, relatively straightforward. I'll treat them as though you've never heard of them, even though maybe you have. But in the first story, so the premise is a kind of unusual one. So there is a prisoner who was a magician of the pyramid of Cajolom, and it's never, explained who that is or what that's referring to. But the magician of the pyramid of Cajolom has been subdued by the Spaniards. And Pedro de Alvarado, I guess, is kind of a euphemism for Cortés in the 1500s, devastating the pyramid by fire. And he's the last magician of this dying culture, and he's thrown into a jail cell. And so the premise of this is that the jail cell has a unique structure. It's a circular cell, if you can imagine a cell at the bottom of a cistern or something, divided in half by a wall with just a grate or a bar in between. So on one side of the cell is the magician, Sinakan. On the other is the jaguar. And again, Borges never explains why the jaguar is there, what purpose he serves. I think this is more of a thought experiment than a realistic plot, but we'll have to treat it that way. So anyway, in the other there is a jaguar measuring with secret and even paces the time and space of captivity. There was a slightly longer quote I wanted to read from this, because it goes out of its way. Borges goes out of his way to say that Sinakan was a man who performed many sacrifices. That was the source of his power. He was essentially an Aztec, even though he's never described specifically as an Aztec. He was participating in that culture. And so he says, with a deep obsidian knife, I have cut open the breasts of victims, and now I could not, without magic, lift myself from the dust. He's had a reversal of fortune, right? Now the supreme powerful magician of the former culture is now the victim who is groveling in dust in the jail cell. On the eve of the burning of the pyramid, the men who got down from the towering horses tortured me with fiery metals to force me to reveal the location of a hidden treasure. They struck down the idol of the god before my very eyes, but he did not abandon me, and I endured the torments in silence. They scourged me, they broke and deformed me, and then I awoke into this prison from which I will not emerge in mortal life. So you understand the premise, right? He is stuck in this cell with no hope of ever being released. Then it goes on to say that he is mostly in darkness all day, except for a few minutes in which the jailer opens the skylight at the top of the cell. He lowers down some food and some water. And in that brief moment of a few seconds, of light, he can look over into the other side of the cell and see the jaguar. So he's been there for so long. He's been there for years and years and years. And he imagines after a certain point that he's even memorized the pattern of spots on the jaguar's fur, right? Is he hallucinating? Is he insane? Has he actually done this? But in his mind, he's memorized this pattern of spots. And not only that, but that these spots on the jaguar's fur contain a hidden message sent to him since the beginning of time by his god, the god Kahalum, right? So the god Kahalum. It's pretty clear at this point that he's talking about, the figure that we've seen in the cover image for this conference, Tezcatlipoca, right? The smoking mirror of Tezcatlipoca. This is an image of him from a codex. He as he's thinking about the fact that he will never emerge from this prison cell, he says, that anxiety was consuming me when I remembered that the jaguar was one of the attributes of the god. And this is kind of a dead giveaway because Tezcatlipoca is his animal form is the jaguar. So we're supposed to understand that this is kind of what he's referring to. I won't read this giant wall of text here, but the idea is, now that he has the idea that the jaguar's spots represent a hidden message from the gods, then he speculates on it for a while and he says, well, what would such a message even be? What could be the message of a god? He goes through this thought. He says, well, it's kind of humbling because that means that every jaguar since the beginning of time has had to reproduce and reconfigure its spots so they appeared in just this particular way for just him to read in this moment. Again, is he insane or is he, coming to some spiritual epiphany? We're not quite sure. But he says, gradually the concrete enigma I labored at disturbed me less than the generic enigma of a sentence written by a god. What type of sentence, I asked myself, will an absolute mind construct? And what he understands is that there's no word that a God could speak that would not imply all other words, right? So, and here you have a passage that kind of explains that. I considered that in the language of a God, every word would enunciate that infinite concatenation of facts, not in an implicit, but in an explicit manner, not progressively, but instantaneously. In time, the notion of a divine sentence seemed puerile or blasphemous. A God, I reflected, ought to utter only a single word, and in that word, absolute fullness. This is going to have some Girardian resonances after this, but the idea that a God would only need to speak a single word, and in that word would be contained all other words, right? That's the idea. After some time, he's sort of pondering this, and he has a dream or nightmare or hallucination of himself being smothered by grains of sand, and they keep multiplying over and over and over. And he finds himself drowning in these grains of sand. And in this moment, as he feels like he's being buried under this avalanche of sand, he has a moment of awakening, a sort of spiritual epiphany. In the darkness above, there grew a circle of light. I saw the face and hands of the jailer, the sheave, the rope, the flesh, and the water jug. A man becomes confused gradually with the form of his destiny. A man is by and large his circumstances. More than a decipherer or an avenger, more than a priest of the god, I was one imprisoned. From the tireless labyrinth of dreams, I returned as if to my home, to the harsh prison. I blessed its dampness. I blessed its tiger. He uses the word tiger and jaguar kind of interchangeably. I blessed the crevice of light. I blessed my old suffering body. I blessed the darkness and the stone. Then there occurred, notice his use of the passive tense, what I cannot forget nor communicate. There occurred the union with the divinity, with the universe. So somehow the realization is that he and all other things are one and the same, and that being the prisoner or the magician or the conqueror are all the same thing, right? There's no fundamental difference. This is his realization. As a little tangent here, I wanted to talk about the jaguar for a second. So this is the familiar image over on the right that we've seen ever since coming here. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, a central deity in Aztec mythology associated with night, magic, conflict, and change, etc. Involved in the creation of the world and the destiny of humanity, influencing various aspects of Aztec life. This part I thought was pretty interesting, the idea that the practice of human sacrifice was introduced into central Mexico under the auspices of this deity, Tezcatlipoca, right? So caused the death of many Toltecs, generally seen as a threatening and dangerous god, but over time becoming one that one could appeal to for certain types of help or protection. He was the protector of slaves and severely punished masters who ill-treated Tezcatlipoca's beloved children. He rewarded virtue by bestowing riches and fame, and he chastised wrongdoers, etc. So we have this jaguar god who has kind of an ambivalent character. On the one hand, a sacrificer. On the other hand, a protector, right? So anyway, so as he has this epiphany about the jaguar. Another side note, this is Girardian idea through Eugene Webb. Eugene Webb has an article that's worth reading. It's called Girard's Sacrifice and Religious Symbolism, I think is the name of the article. And when he talks about mimetic desire, he says this: desire is illusory. We do not really want what we think we want, for the reasons we think we want it. We want it because we think mistakenly that the reason our mediator of desire wants it is that he actually knows what will enhance his being and make it invulnerable. Even if we could acquire the object of desire, it would not bring us satisfaction because the being and invulnerability we long for, of which the object is only a symbol, will always remain out of reach. We are finite and can never achieve the divine supersufficiency or plenitude of being that we attribute to our model, basically. To win freedom from self-imprisonment in this system of illusion requires that one both realize its structure and be willing to relinquish its illusory comforts, etc. I should read this part. In particular, the comforting belief that if only one could make just a little more progress in acquiring the mediator's objects or becoming what the mediator is, then one would enjoy the plenitude of being one longs for. So that's a kind of a Girardian take. Because the story ends with our magician, Sinakan, realizing that he now knows the secret of the pattern of the spots, and that he could use it. He could use this power to immediately turn the tables on his attackers, on the Spaniards, right? He could immediately get himself out of the cell, and he could restore the old empire, and he, just by uttering this magical sentence of the god, the god script, basically. And instead, he decides, what's the point, you know? If I think that this will bring me some satisfaction, then I'm mistaken. He says this, 40 syllables, 14 words, and I, Tsinakan, would rule the land Montezuma ruled. But I know I shall never say those words because I no longer remember Tsinakan. May the mystery lettered on the tigers die with me. Whoever has seen the universe, has beheld the fiery designs of the universe, cannot think in terms of one man, though he be that very man. That man has been he, and now matters no more to him. What is the life of that other to him, the nation of that other to him, if he now is no one? That is why I do not pronounce the formula, why lying here in the darkness, I let the days obliterate me. So, the story ends where it began. He is a prisoner in the bottom of a cell, totally devastated, with no possibility of escape. But at the end, he says he has the magical formula that would allow him to escape. Only he has discovered that, that it has no meaning to him anymore. And I think this quote kind of goes nicely with that ending. So that's story number one. And then story number two is shorter and easier to summarize. This is Julio Cortazar, the Argentinian writer of the boom generation. The story really came out only 7 years after the first one that I mentioned. Cortazar was a great admirer of Borges. On the other hand, I would think that this story is a little bit of I wouldn't say a contradiction to Borges, but maybe a challenge to Borges in certain ways of thinking. You've seen these little creatures, the axolotls, right? They're these adorable little salamanders with dark eyes, native to Mexico. And so the plot of this story is a kind of a nameless narrator who goes to an aquarium in Paris, the Jardin des Plantes. Apparently, in real life, these axolotls were brought to Paris and they were kind of a sensation. No one had ever seen these creatures before. And so he describes a man who goes to this aquarium and looks at these creatures in a tank. He becomes so fascinated with them that he has to come back again and again, day after day, staring at them, imagining that he sees something in them. What particularly gets him are the eyes. The eyes are almost kind of hollow and they don't reflect back anything. And he even says the fact that they didn't seem to possess any human resemblance to himself was what captivated him, right? He wasn't looking for a mirror image of himself. It was the complete otherness of these creatures that caught his attention. And he talks about their little pink Aztec faces, which is kind of a giveaway, that he's sort of looking for some metaphor to make sense of these alien creatures. What are they? Where did they come from? He starts doing scientific research. He finds out that they're the larval form of a certain type of salamander, etc. But Anyway, so he keeps studying them intensely over and over until at one point he finds himself looking out of the tank. And that doesn't make any sense, right? He was the visitor to the aquarium looking into the tank. Somehow now he's looking out of the tank at the man that he once was. And at the very end of the story, he has changed places with the axolotl. The object of his fascination, right? And if this makes any sense, you become so fascinated by something that you literally become that thing, or you try to embody it. And think back to the Girardian connection from before, right? The mimetic desire, wanting not the object, but the qualities of the rival or the mediator, right? Being so engrossed or encapsulated by that person. So he literally becomes an axolotl, and he sees the man that he once was walking away, never to come back, right? So where does this leave us? Again, just a couple quotes here. Above all else, their eyes obsessed me. In the standing tanks on either side of them, different fishes showed me the simple stupidity of their handsome eyes, so similar to our own. The eyes of the axolotl spoke to me of the presence of a different life, of another way of seeing. And he goes on to say, they looked at him from an unfathomable depth. And this is the ending of the story. I was an axolotl, and now I knew instantly that no understanding was possible. He meaning himself, his former self, was outside the aquarium. His thinking was a thinking outside the tank. Recognizing him, being himself, I was an axolotl in my world. This goes in a different direction, though, and I think you'll notice this. The horror began, I learned in that same moment, of believing myself prisoner in the body of an axolotl. So again, we have the premise that we saw in the first story of a man who was not only free but powerful, now being reduced to the state of a prisoner, right? Now he becomes the axolotl. He's a prisoner in the tank, condemned to move lucidly among unconscious creatures. And as he talks about the other axolotls in the tank, he feels one of their feet grazing over his head. And this is just kind of a horrifying moment to him when he realizes that none of them are even aware that the others are there. They're sort of all trapped silently in this tank together. And maybe that's a metaphor, maybe that's some sort of existentialist metaphor for what we humans are like among other humans, right? Anyway, I thought I would bring up a myth that might be under the surface of this story. This is a deity that isn't mentioned very often compared to Tezcatlipoca. Everyone knows that one. Xolotl, the underworld dog god of the Aztecs, twin of Quetzalcoatl. This is a figure that's not really discussed very much, but when he is discussed, he's in the form of a dog. His feet are usually twisted backwards. He's usually depicted with hollow eyes, kind of like the axolotl I was mentioning before. This is a deity of death and sickness and carnage and so forth. And there's an interesting myth around this that I think connects to the story that Cortazar wrote. When the gods created the fifth sun, they realized that it did not move. Therefore, they decided to sacrifice themselves in order to get the sun to move. As we know, Aztec culture was very deeply rooted in sacrifice as a way of revivifying life, or creating the world, right? Xolotl acted as the executioner and killed the gods one by one. In some versions of the myth, Xolotl commits suicide at the end, as he was supposed to do. In other versions, however, Xolotl takes on the role of a trickster and escapes from the sacrifice by first transforming into a young maize plant, and we have the Nahuatl word there, Xolotl, then an agave, Mexolotl, and finally a salamander, Axolotl. In the end, however, he failed to escape and was killed by Quetzalcoatl. So the idea is the transformations of this deity into first an animal, finally into a human that's killed, a sacrificial victim, in other words. He is supposed to be part of the sacrifice. he tries to escape it by becoming an axolotl. And so now, when we read this myth, it's hard to read the Cortazar story the same way again, right? This man who goes into an aquarium and suddenly transforms into a salamander, just like the deity Xolotl. Something to do with the necessity of sacrifice, the realization that one is not oneself, that one has been substituted for another. There's some deep Girardian links to be made there. And I put this as a potential conclusion to this discussion, but I'm curious to hear if anyone has any, maybe different perspectives. For me, for Borges, the magician Sinacan hints at the possibility of transcending desire through the annihilation of the self. The idea is that he realizes that he has the magical power to recover his own position as the magician of Kaholom. He rejects it. He annihilates himself. That's his realization. There is no difference between him and the conqueror. There's no point to this game. It doesn't end anywhere, right? The sacrificial logic keeps requiring new substitutes, new victims. It never comes to a resting point, right? So that's my first thought. For Cortazar, on the other hand, the sacrifice doesn't have that sort of, how can I say, it doesn't have that sort of a spiritual component to it. There's more of an existential component, a realization that he's just one of many, and they're all sort of condemned to imprisonment in this metaphorical tank, right? And maybe it's a statement about us as humans that, this Girardian logic of substitution, mimesis and substitution and sacrifice ultimately doesn't lead anywhere. It only leads us to a place of horror and isolation and so forth. But this is a provisional conclusion. I don't know what else to say about it, except that I thought it would be good to put these stories in dialogue with each other. I think Cortazar definitely would have read the Borges story, definitely would have understood that it had a subtext of Mexican, Mesoamerican religion, mythology. I think he was deeply aware of Xolotl as a deity, even though that's not a familiar deity to most people who know something about this tradition. And so I can only assume that the second story was a response to the first one. Where that leads us, I'm not quite sure, but that's what I have to say. So.
Question, comments, connections.
Thank you. My own anecdote is that I visited the Templo Mayor this morning, and you seem to know this business much better than I do, but I think it might have been in room 6 or something. They have animals, and the jaguar apparently was quite high up on the list of the sacrificial animals. And I was thinking of the first plenary today, where both of the speakers, Olivier and de Klerk, we're talking about the identification between the priest and the sacrificial victim. So I just was wondering if that was relevant to the Sinacan versus the jaguar also.
Yeah, I think I would like to. I haven't had a chance to go. I want to see it actually. I'm really looking forward. It's right there. I know. Yeah, because Sinacan is both the priest and the victim at the same time, right? And I don't know. I think he's capturing, or that is capturing, the ambiguity around Tezcatlipoca as the sacrificer, also the protector, the killer and the empowerer at the same time. Somehow it's impossible to separate those two poles from each other. It doesn't leave us with any, fixed ground to stand upon, but I think it's an interesting ambivalence. Yeah.
The first story also has the horror, but then he he becomes the willing sacrifice, and then he's united with God. So it seems very much it's sort of the Jesus story in a way, but and also makes me think of this story I was talking about where the woman surrenders and becomes she's not united with God, but she's united in a holy ritual. So I also haven't read these stories, but they sound fascinating. Is there supposed to be like a funny thing in Cortazar? Like, because it almost sounds like a Pixar movie or something. Like, is there a comedic aspect to this story where he's identifying with these salamanders, or?
Yeah, the story isn't written with any kind of a humorous tone. I think we talking about it can find it very funny and ridiculous. Just the idea of, obsessive attention to these creatures. But no, it isn't. I don't think it's meant to be funny. But as for the first thing that you said, though, I thought that was interesting. Because I think, Girard in Things Hidden talks about Jesus as the one who sort of unmasks the victimage mechanism, right? In this Borges story, in a sense, he kind of does that too. Yeah, he's sort of like, I've seen through the rules of this game. I no longer want to play it. I'm not, I could become the sacrificer myself. I choose not to, right? So he kind of unmasked the rules of the game, but he's not doing it to anyone or for anyone. Like, there's no one here to hear that message. He's still dying at the bottom of a cell. So, he's not proclaiming a gospel somewhere that he can communicate to others.
The story is the record of it.
I guess the story is the record. Yeah, but
it's still a kind of divine act, though.
Yeah.
I mean, the way you describe it.
Yeah.
Because it brings him unity with the divine.
Yeah.
Yeah. But is the horror in the second story the loss of consciousness of communication, or is it just the horror of that I'm trapped in a aquarium? Because he had that other little salamander who touched his face, and they were, he could have a new community of salamanders.
Yeah. I think there's I don't know, when he's a human looking at an axolotl.
Yeah.
What he perceives is their complete otherness, right?
Mm-hmm.
He can't even make any sort of a, metaphor that makes any sense. He's trying to describe them. Pink Aztec faces. At one point, he talks about them looking like Chinese porcelain dolls, which they don't, but he's just trying really hard to make some connection to them. The idea is that once he becomes an axolotl, maybe there would be some possibility of connection, in theory. But no, there isn't. There's just another one kicking him in the head, completely unaware that he's there. So the horror is the idea that there is no, there's no shared consciousness. There's no awareness.
Surrender to the new way of living.
Yeah.
Why did he say it? Okay, I'll stop talking about it. It's interesting that it's set in Paris.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why that story is?
It's a good question. I mean, Cortazar he was Argentinian by lineage, but he was born in Belgium. He was born in Brussels. He spent a lot of time in Europe. I'm not sure if he actually saw those in real life in Paris. He may have. I know it was kind of a sensation when they were first brought there, but no, I'm not quite sure.
Thank you.
So, anyway.
I'm kind of interested in how more connections we might make between all three papers. It's interesting that the works all, kind of contemporary, at least from my perspective as someone who works on medieval literature, and all having to do with it. It seems like in various ways a kind of critique of Western rationalism, finding its emptiness, and I wonder how to think about a Girardian understanding of Western rationalism in relation to them, which is that seems like a tricky issue that was raised already about is our rationalism revealed to be our own kind of sacred, and then that's exposed, or there would be another, I guess, reading of the exposure is the true rationalism, but and then what are these texts looking for as an alternative, and how do they compare with each other in that respect? And just throwing it open. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because partly the last two papers, you see this parallel again and again of one of the most characteristic Western gestures is to disavow the West. It's almost a signature move. And you can go back to Socrates, or you can go back to the Old Testament and New Testament. It's this ongoing autocritique that the West always loses itself to find itself. Smell to all that. It always feels like they want to be a magician that believes their own tricks. They want to get back to something. It's interesting in the axolotl, if you trace the myth, it goes from almost like vegetable to animal to human, and it's reversing back the same way. But or this idea of the refusal of mediation. You want to get rid of mediation, the priest, or something that stands in between me and brute reality, or me and the sacred, or this. And so there's this ongoing Western mourning, which of course is constitutively Western, of trying to run back time or something. Of course, there's another version of it in Rousseau and in Romanticism and so on. And it's not a question, just a response, Curtis, to what you were saying,
Following up somewhat randomly, but you were saying between the papers on the question of rationality, a number of thoughts came to me, and probably Chris should be saying this rather than me, but it seems to me it's not clear in Girard overall, how rationality would relate. Because I think you were talking about the ushering out of the sacrificial system in favor of a new anti-sacrificial system. You were talking about maybe that one scene where the woman is about to be killed, and it seems to me that the first thought that came to mind for me on that is that's revelation according to Girard, right? It's not a rational process. It has to come in the form of a revelation. But then other passages in Girard that would seem related to that is the one in Violence and the Sacred, maybe the second chapter. He's talking about the move from the cycles of vengeance, with the système vindicatoire in French, to the judicial system, which he talks about in terms that are somewhat ambiguous, kind of like what you were saying, but maybe you weren't thinking that passage. But he uses the word rational in there at some point, but I think he qualifies it somehow. So the matter of where rationality fits in with Girard, I think he's somewhat skeptical about rationality, and but the main shift seems to me having to do with revelation in Girard, and it's something that comes from without.
That so appears to.
Because this is one thing I am not a Girardian expert by any means. So, but why is it a revelation that the scapegoat is innocent? Why is that a revelation? Isn't that a realization that anyone can recognize? Isn't the true revelation in the Gospels of the divinity of Jesus, which seems always more muted in Girard, which is always interesting to me too. Like for him, the true revelation is the breaking of this cycle, but very little is said about, he rose from the dead, and he's the savior, and he is coming again, and all the Paul letters that sort of define Christianity. So I mean, why is it revelation and not rationality that makes people think? I mean, they think and they, well, wait a second, that person was innocent, and that's not right, is it like a magic realization? Is that the, see, I don't know. That's,
Yeah, as I understand it, it's the great revelation is through Jesus suffering in such a way as to reveal the innocence of the victim, and that is also the divinity. That is the true divine being revealed. So there can, I mean, just in that connected in that sense. But then you also have his reading of Sophocles' Oedipus, where Sophocles seems to be kind of on the way to something like this exposure and this critique. So it comes elsewhere, that's I think it's an interesting unresolved issue in some ways. Yeah. I think we're meant to be out of the building at 8. So, but thanks for the papers and thanks for, real stimulating, interesting.
I have 30 seconds to.
Yeah, right?
Thank you.
It was.